By the time I pulled into my driveway that Friday evening, the red notice on my backyard gate was bright enough to see from the street. I thought it was another landscaping reminder until I got close enough to read the words printed across the top: Final Enforcement Notice. According to the HOA, my wooden fence had never been approved. They claimed it violated current architectural standards, ordered me to remove it, and said I had already accumulated $3,750 in fines. Another $100 would be added every day until I complied. What made it worse was the audience. 3 members of the HOA board were standing across the street with a contractor who had already begun measuring the length of my fence from the sidewalk. Linda Carver, the HOA president, watched me read the notice with the calm confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. The paperwork stated that the association had reviewed its records and found no evidence that my fence had ever received authorization. That sentence stopped me cold. The fence had been standing for 12 years. I had not hidden it. I had not built it overnight. My father and I had submitted the architectural request ourselves, waited for approval, purchased the exact materials listed in the application, and built the fence only after the HOA sent us written permission. Now the same association was pretending none of that had ever happened. The notice warned that if I failed to remove the fence, the matter could be referred to the HOA attorney, additional legal fees could be charged to my account, and the board could pursue collection remedies against my property. I felt the anger rising, but I did not tear down the notice. I did not argue in the street. I took out my phone and photographed every page: the contractor, the board members, and the tape measure stretched along the edge of my yard. Then I went inside. At that moment, Linda probably thought I was scared. She had no idea that somewhere inside my house was a 12-year-old paper trail with the HOA's own signatures on it. And once I found it, the question would no longer be whether my fence was legal. The question would be why the HOA had tried so hard to convince everyone that their own approval never existed. I had never considered myself the kind of person who would end up in a fight with an HOA. I worked as an electrical technician, left the house early, came home tired, kept my lawn trimmed, paid every assessment on time, and mostly stayed out of neighborhood politics. I did not attend board meetings unless something directly affected my property, and for years, that arrangement worked perfectly for me. I bought the house 12 years earlier after saving for what felt like half my adult life. It was not a luxury home. It was a quiet 3-bedroom place on the edge of a growing North Carolina subdivision, with a small garage, a deep backyard, and enough space between the houses that I could sit outside after work without feeling like I was living on top of somebody else. My father, Robert, loved the place almost as much as I did. He had spent most of his life fixing things instead of replacing them. When I moved in, he helped me repaint the garage, replace a sagging section of deck, repair 2 gates, and build shelves along one wall of the workshop. He believed there was a right way to do almost everything, especially when property was involved. Before we drove a single fence post into the ground, he made sure I had checked the HOA rules. We measured the backyard twice. I drew a basic site plan showing the fence location. We selected the stain color from the association's approved palette and submitted an architectural request with the dimensions, materials, and layout. Then we waited. Weeks later, an envelope arrived from the HOA. The application had been approved. Only after that did my father and I buy the lumber. We spent several weekends building the fence one section at a time. He insisted on setting every post carefully and checking the line again before the concrete cured. By the time we finished, the fence stood straight, clean, and completely inside my property boundary. To everyone else, it was just wood. To me, it was one of the last major projects my father and I completed together. Years later, after he was gone, I could still walk along that fence and remember him measuring the spacing between posts, correcting things nobody else would ever notice, and refusing to rush because he said anything worth building should still be standing when you were no longer around to explain how you built it. That was why the HOA's notice bothered me in a way the board probably never understood. They were not simply asking me to replace an old fence. They were declaring that the entire process my father and I had followed never happened. The neighborhood had changed since those early years. New homes went up. Property values climbed. The original board members gradually moved away or stopped serving. Then Linda Carver became president, and the HOA began pushing what it called neighborhood modernization. Suddenly there were more inspections, more violation letters, more discussions about uniformity and curb appeal. Mailboxes had to match newer standards, garage doors received extra scrutiny, landscaping notices became more frequent. Residents who had lived there for years started discovering that things nobody had questioned before were suddenly attracting the board's attention. I had complied whenever the requests made sense. I moved my trash cans behind the house. I pressure washed the driveway after receiving a reminder. I even replaced an exterior light fixture when the board revised its guidelines. I was not looking for a fight. But there was a difference between following reasonable community standards and allowing someone to rewrite the history of my own property. If you have ever dealt with an HOA that suddenly decided something approved years earlier was now a violation, you probably understand why this mattered. Share your experience in the comments, and if stories about property rights, neighborhood disputes, and homeowners standing up with evidence interest you, save the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more. At first, I still believed the situation could be solved by showing the board that a mistake had been made. Then I sent one simple request, asking them to show me exactly what records they had reviewed. What came back made me realize this was not going to be a simple clerical error. The next morning, I sent the HOA a written request asking for the exact records they had reviewed before deciding my fence was unauthorized. I kept the message simple. I wanted the approval history, the architectural file, and the rule they were using to justify the fine. What came back was not an explanation. It was a demand. The board stated that its current electronic records contained no approval for my fence, and that because no approval could be located, I had two options: remove the fence or submit a new architectural application under the current guidelines. That second option bothered me immediately. If I submitted a new application, it would look as though I was admitting the fence had never been approved in the first place. It would also allow the board to judge a 12-year-old structure under standards adopted long after my father and I built it. I refused to do that. Within 48 hours, another notice appeared in my mailbox. The daily fines would continue. The HOA also warned that legal expenses associated with enforcement could be added to my account. Then the pressure became physical. On Monday afternoon, I came home early and found a man in a contractor's vest standing near the rear corner of my lot. He had a measuring wheel, a clipboard, and a tape stretched along the outside of my fence. Two HOA board members were standing nearby watching him work. I walked the property line without touching anyone or interfering with the equipment. I photographed the contractor, his company logo, the measurements, and the board members present. I also photographed the survey pin near the corner of the lot so there could be no later argument about where my property began. The contractor left a short time later. That evening, the HOA sent me another email stating that the board was evaluating corrective action and had requested estimates related to removal and replacement. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling administrative. They were pricing out the destruction of something they had approved. The following week, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney. The letter described my fence as an unapproved architectural modification and stated that continued non-compliance could result in additional fines, collection costs, legal fees, and further enforcement remedies. The tone was clinical, but the message was obvious. Pay, remove the fence, or prepare to spend money defending yourself. I began noticing the social pressure too. At the mailbox cluster, neighbors who normally greeted me kept conversations short. One man mentioned that he had heard I was refusing to bring my property into compliance. Another homeowner warned me that fighting the HOA could become expensive even if I believed I was right. That was exactly the advantage the board had. They did not need to prove their case immediately. They only needed to make resistance expensive enough that I would surrender. At the next neighborhood meeting, the agenda listed my property under architectural enforcement. The fence was described as a long-standing unauthorized structure that had failed current design standards. That phrase made my stomach turn. Long-standing unauthorized structure. For 12 years, the HOA had collected dues from me while that fence stood in plain view. Board members had walked past it. Landscaping inspections had been conducted around it. Homes on both sides of mine had been sold. Nobody had ever suggested it was illegal. Now the board was trying to convert its own missing paperwork into my violation. A few days later, I saw orange marking paint near one section of the fence. Nothing had been damaged, but the timing was enough to concern me. I checked my exterior cameras and found footage of the same contractor returning to the area earlier that morning. He stayed outside the fence, but he photographed several sections and measured the gate opening. I saved the footage immediately. Then I created a separate backup. By that point, the fines had climbed higher, and the board was preparing to discuss enforcement again. The HOA had already created a paper trail portraying me as a homeowner who had repeatedly refused to correct a known violation. If I continued arguing from memory, I was going to lose. I needed documents. Not memories, not assumptions, not the fact that the fence had stood there for 12 years. I needed the original application, the original approval, the old architectural standards, and anything showing exactly what the HOA knew before it started threatening me. So I stopped answering every accusation as it arrived. Instead, I started building a file of my own, and the first place I looked was the one place the HOA had apparently forgotten existed, the records my father had kept from the year we built the fence. I started with the garage. My father had kept records the way some people keep family photographs. Receipts went into envelopes. Manuals were labeled. Property documents were filed by year. At the time, I used to tease him about it. Now I was standing in front of an old metal cabinet hoping that habit might save me thousands of dollars. The first box gave me nothing useful. The second was full of appliance warranties and tax records. Then, buried behind a stack of old insurance papers, I found a folder with 2 words written across the front in my father's handwriting. Fence, HOA. I sat down right there on the garage floor. Inside was the original site sketch I had drawn, the materials list, the stain color reference, a copy of the architectural request, and several receipts from the lumber supplier. Then I found the letter. It was a photocopy, slightly faded around the edges, but the header was unmistakable. The HOA name was printed across the top. Below it was the property address, the date, the architectural review number, and the words I had been trying to prove existed. Approved as submitted. 3 names appeared at the bottom. One belonged to a former architectural committee member. Another was the old board secretary. The third signature was harder to read, but it did not matter yet. For the first time since the fines started, I felt the balance shift. But a photocopy was not enough for me. If the HOA was willing to claim no approval existed, I needed more than a piece of paper they could dismiss as incomplete, outdated, or unverifiable. So I began building the file properly. I scanned every page at high resolution. I saved copies to my computer, an external drive, and cloud storage. I photographed the physical folder exactly as I had found it. I created a timeline showing when the application was submitted, when approval was issued, when materials were purchased, and when the fence was completed. Then I went through every email and noticed the HOA had sent me. I sorted them by date. I highlighted every time they claimed no approval existed. I marked every threat of additional fines, attorney fees, or corrective action. I saved the contractor footage from my security cameras and copied the original video files before doing anything else with them. After that, I pulled the current HOA bylaws and architectural guidelines. The rules had changed. The newer guidelines clearly favored white vinyl fencing in several visible areas of the neighborhood. My wooden fence did not match the newer look the board was promoting, but the documents did not say that an improvement legally approved under an older standard automatically became unauthorized later. That distinction mattered. I requested the HOA's historical architectural rules from the year my fence was built. Again, the answer was that older records were not readily available. I also requested meeting minutes and archived architectural records connected to the review number printed on my approval letter. That request went unanswered, so I expanded the search outside the HOA. I checked county property records. I confirmed the parcel dimensions. I reviewed the recorded plat. I verified that there was no easement running through the section where the fence stood. Then I hired a licensed surveyor. A few days later, he walked the backyard with survey equipment, located the property corners, and checked the fence lines section by section. The result was clean. The fence was inside my property. It did not cross the property line. It did not interfere with a recorded easement. And based on the county requirements that applied when it was built, there was no missing county permit the HOA could point to as a separate violation. That took away another possible argument. Next, I contacted an attorney who handled HOA and property disputes. I brought everything: the notices, the emails, the contractor photos, the camera footage, the survey, the bylaws, the old application, and the faded approval letter my father had saved. The attorney spent several minutes reading without saying much. Then he focused on the bottom of the approval letter. There was more there than I had noticed. A file reference number, a committee notation, a date stamp, and the name of the former HOA secretary. He explained that if the approval had been processed through the association's normal architectural review system, there was a strong chance another copy had existed somewhere in the HOA's old records, board files, archived email, or former committee backups. That was when he told me not to send the board everything yet. Instead, he recommended a preservation request. The HOA would be formally instructed to preserve records related to my property, historical architectural approvals, board communications, archived files, and any documents used to justify enforcement. That changed the nature of the dispute. Until then, Linda had been treating me like a homeowner begging the board to reconsider. Now there would be a record of exactly what documents existed, what they claimed to have reviewed, and what they did after being told evidence might contradict their position. I also started contacting former board members. Most never replied. One had moved out of state. Another said he did not remember my fence. Then I found the name Patricia Wells. She had served on the architectural committee the year my application was approved. I sent her a short message explaining that the HOA was claiming no authorization had ever existed and asked whether she recognized the approval letter. Her response came the next morning. She recognized it immediately. Not only the format, not only the signatures, the file number. She told me she might still have something from the old records migration project. I read that message 3 times. Because if Patricia still had what I thought she had, this was no longer going to be my word against the HOA. It was going to be their own archived record against their current president. Patricia called me 2 days later. She had found the files. Years earlier, when the HOA was moving old paper records into a digital system, Patricia had helped scan architectural applications and store backup copies. Most of those files were supposed to be transferred to the association's main archive, but she had kept an old external drive containing working copies from the migration. My property was on it. Not just the approval letter, everything. The original architectural request was there with my signature. The site sketch matched the one I had found in my father's folder. The committee notes showed that the fence height, stain color, placement, and materials had all been reviewed. Then came the document that changed the case. A scanned approval sheet contained the same file number printed on my photocopy, the same date stamp, and the same signatures. At the bottom, in plain language, were 3 words: approved as submitted. There was no ambiguity left. The HOA had approved the fence. I forwarded the archive to my attorney, along with Patricia's explanation of where the files came from. He reviewed the metadata, compared the documents to my copy, and then turned his attention to the current HOA rules. That was where the second problem appeared. The board was relying heavily on newer design standards that favored white vinyl fencing in visible sections of the neighborhood, but my fence had been approved long before those standards existed. Nothing in the documents we reviewed gave the board the right to simply erase a prior approval because a future board preferred a different material. That meant Linda had been trying to treat a legally approved improvement as if it had never received approval at all, and the emails made the situation worse. One message from another board member asked whether the HOA should check older paper records before moving forward with enforcement. Linda's response was already sitting in the email chain I had saved. She said it was unnecessary because the current system showed no approval. That sentence became important. The problem was no longer just that the HOA had lost or failed to migrate an old record. The board had been warned that older records might exist. They had chosen not to look. Then they fined me anyway. My attorney prepared a demand letter. It required the HOA to suspend all enforcement, preserve every record connected to my property, withdraw the fines, and confirm in writing that no contractor or board representative would enter my property or remove any portion of the fence. The letter also identified the archived approval records and informed the association that continued enforcement after receiving them could expose the HOA to additional legal costs and claims. I expected the board to back down. Instead, Linda doubled down. A new email stated that the board would review the materials at the next meeting, but that my violation would remain active until the board formally decided otherwise. The fines continued appearing on my account. That decision gave us something else. A clear timeline showing that the HOA kept enforcing the violation even after receiving direct evidence of the original approval. My attorney told me to stop arguing with them. From that point on, every communication went through him. We assembled the documents in order: the original application, the archived approval, the committee notes, the survey, the current bylaws, the older architectural materials Patricia still had, the enforcement notices, the attorney letter, the contractor photographs, the camera footage, and the internal emails, showing that at least one board member had suggested checking older records before the fines escalated. Then Patricia found one final item. It was an internal email from the year my fence had been approved. The message had been sent between two members of the architectural committee after their review. It referenced my property by address and confirmed that the application had passed without conditions. That destroyed the last possible argument that the approval sheet was incomplete or somehow unrelated to my fence. There were now multiple independent records pointing to the same conclusion. The fence was approved. The location was correct. The property line was correct. There was no missing county permit issue. And the HOA had no credible basis for calling the structure unauthorized. But my attorney noticed something else in the current enforcement policy. Before severe collection action could continue on an architectural violation, the homeowner had to be given a meaningful opportunity to contest the basis of the violation. The board had scheduled that hearing. It would happen at the next public meeting. Linda clearly thought the meeting would be her chance to make me explain myself in front of the neighborhood. My attorney saw it differently. He told me not to send the full document package to every board member in advance. The association's attorney had already received notice of the evidence. That was enough. At the hearing, Linda would have to state the HOA's position on the record. If she claimed again that the fence had never been approved, we had the original records. If she changed the argument and claimed the approval no longer mattered, we had the rules and the dates. If she blamed missing files, we had evidence that the board had been told to check the archive before enforcement escalated. For the first time, there was no version of the story that helped them. I printed everything anyway. I organized the evidence into a thick binder with tabs. The red final enforcement notice went in the front. The original approval went near the end. I wanted the sequence to be impossible to misunderstand. On one side was the accusation. On the other was the HOA's own signature proving the accusation was false. The night before the meeting, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at that signature again. My father had kept the first copy because he believed paperwork mattered. Patricia had kept the archived copy because records mattered. And Linda had built the entire case against me on the assumption that neither one still existed. The next evening, I carried the binder into the HOA clubhouse. Linda was already seated at the front of the room. She looked completely confident. She had no idea that I was carrying 12 years of her association's own history under my arm. The clubhouse was fuller than I had ever seen it. Word had spread that the board was holding an enforcement hearing over my fence, and by the time the meeting started, nearly every chair was occupied. Linda sat at the center of the table with the other board members beside her. The HOA attorney was off to one side with a legal pad in front of him. My attorney sat next to me. The binder was on the table between us. Linda opened the hearing by describing my fence as an unauthorized architectural modification that had remained out of compliance despite multiple notices. She said the board had given me several opportunities to correct the violation and that I had refused. Then my attorney asked one question. He wanted Linda to confirm, for the record, that the association's position was that my fence had never been approved. Linda confirmed it. That was the moment everything changed. My attorney opened the binder. The first document was the architectural application from 12 years earlier. The next page was the site sketch. Then came the committee notes. Then the scanned approval sheet from Patricia's archive. He placed a copy in front of each board member. The room became completely quiet. One of the board members leaned closer to the page. Another looked toward Linda. The approval number matched the old application. The date matched. The property address matched. The signatures matched. And at the bottom were the same words I had found in my father's file. Approved as submitted. The HOA attorney stopped writing. My attorney then produced the newer survey confirming the fence was inside my property line and did not interfere with any recorded easement. He followed that with the archived internal email confirming the application had passed without conditions. Then he showed the current board email, where one member had suggested checking older records before enforcement continued. Linda's response was included directly beneath it. She had said the search was unnecessary. That was the document that changed the room. The board could no longer pretend this was simply an innocent record-keeping mistake. They had been warned the old records might exist. They had chosen not to check, and they had continued fining me. One board member asked why he had never been shown the archived approval before the enforcement vote. Another asked why a contractor had been sent to measure my fence before the board had verified whether the violation was valid. Linda tried to redirect the discussion toward current neighborhood standards, but the association's own attorney interrupted. He asked for a recess. For the next 15 minutes, the board disappeared into a private conference with counsel while the rest of us waited. When they returned, Linda looked different. The confidence was gone. The HOA attorney spoke first. He recommended that the board suspend enforcement immediately, pending formal review of the newly confirmed historical records. My attorney responded that suspension was not enough. The board had already received proof of the approval before the meeting. Fines had continued. Legal costs had already been created. A contractor had already been brought to the property. He asked the board to withdraw the violation entirely. He also requested written confirmation that the fence was a valid, previously approved improvement, cancellation of all accumulated fines, removal of legal charges related to the enforcement action, and reimbursement for the survey and reasonable attorney expenses I had been forced to incur. The room stayed silent. Then the board voted. 5 members supported ending enforcement. Linda voted against it. The motion passed. Just like that, the same HOA that had spent weeks telling me I had no proof was now officially acknowledging that its own records supported me. But the consequences did not stop at the fence. Because once the other board members realized how far the case had gone without anyone checking the old archive, they wanted to know who had authorized the contractor, who had approved the escalating fines, and why legal enforcement had continued after contradictory evidence surfaced. What had started as a private dispute over my backyard had become an internal board problem, and Linda was now sitting in the middle of it. The formal correction arrived 3 weeks later. The HOA removed every dollar of the $3,750 in fines from my account. The legal charges connected to the enforcement action disappeared with them. I also received written confirmation that the fence had been validly approved under the architectural standards in effect when it was built, and that no replacement was required. The association reimbursed the cost of the survey and agreed to cover most of the attorney expenses I had incurred after the dispute escalated. But the financial correction was only part of what happened. The board opened an internal review of the enforcement process that had allowed a 12-year-old approval to be treated as if it had never existed. They examined the contractor visit, the failure to check archived records, and the decision to keep fines active after evidence of the old approval had surfaced. Several homeowners began requesting reviews of their own old violations. That created pressure Linda could no longer control. At the next election, she lost the presidency. The new board adopted a policy requiring staff to check historical architectural records before issuing major enforcement penalties against improvements that had existed for years. Older paper files were scanned again, indexed properly, and linked to property addresses so another homeowner would not have to prove the association's own history from scratch. My fence never moved. It stayed exactly where my father and I had built it. A few months later, I repaired one weathered board near the gate. As I worked, I noticed the same measurements he had marked years earlier on the inside of one post. They were faded, but still visible. That mattered more to me than the board vote. The HOA had tried to turn a missing electronic file into evidence that I had done something wrong. If I had panicked, paid the fines, or submitted a new application, they might have succeeded. Instead, I kept the notices. I saved the emails. I checked the property records. I hired the surveyor. I found the old approval. And I let the documents speak louder than the threats. That was the lesson I carried away from the entire mess. Property disputes are rarely won by the person who gets angriest first. They are won by the person who knows where the boundary is, knows what was approved, understands what the records show, and keeps proof when everyone else assumes the paperwork no longer matters. If you have ever had an HOA, neighbor, contractor, or developer challenge something you knew was legally yours, share your experience in the comments. Pass this story along to someone dealing with a similar dispute, save the video in case you ever need the reminder, and subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary homeowners protecting their property with evidence, patience, and the law. My father used to believe that anything important involving property should exist in writing. 12 years after we built that fence together, one faded approval letter proved he had been right.